Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the candles burn low, the stone walls breathe cold air, and every corridor whispers about a kingdom on the edge of collapse. To make it easier to slip into the mood, imagine yourself standing in a quiet modern room at night, with only a warm golden lamp spilling light across the ceiling while the city outside sinks into sleep. You loosen your shoulders, let your fingers rest against the cool surface of your desk, and tell yourself everything is perfectly calm. But then tonight's story drifts in like a strange draft, as if history itself is nudging you to witness a time when every decision of a king could tear a nation apart. And if you think modern-day drama is intense, well, you won't survive this one. Trust me. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we dive in, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Because stories like this always feel richer when we know where each of us is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We slide back into the year 1312, when a newborn entered a world so heavy with tension, it seemed as though the entire kingdom held its breath. Edward, the child who would one day become Edward III, was born in Windsor Castle, yet his arrival did little to soften the turbulence shaking England. His father, Edward II, was barely holding his reign together. From political infighting to disastrous favoritism, the king had turned the country into a boiling pot. The nobility resented him. Scotland had dealt England a humiliating defeat, and the common people were exhausted by famine, war, and a ruler who seemed incapable of steering the realm. This was not the kind of cradle a future king would hope to be placed in. When Edward opened his eyes for the first time, the ground beneath him was already shifting. No one asked whether a child wanted the burden of a kingdom weighted across his shoulders. History rarely offers such luxuries. Inside his nursery, candles flickered softly while attendants walked carefully, as if afraid any sharp movement might shatter the fragile peace of infancy. But beyond those walls, the realm was cracking. Edward II was a paradox, stubborn yet fragile, trusting yet disastrously naive. He poured power into the hands of favorites like Gaveston and later the Despensers, men whose arrogance and influence made the nobility seethe with fury. In that climate of tension, baby Edward's existence was more than an heir's arrival. It was a reminder that the future of England remained tied to a failing dynasty. His mother, Isabella of France, should have been the force that held the royal household together. At first she was, but years of humiliation, neglect, and political alienation transformed her. Eventually, even the queen found herself drifting toward resentment, plotting, and secrets. While Edward played in castle halls or practiced horseback riding under the watch of tutors, the adults around him were weaving a trap that would alter his life forever. He was not named Prince of Wales like many heirs before him. Instead, he held the softer title of Earl of Chester, a subtle reflection of a monarchy too unstable to uphold traditions. His education was shaped less by books and more by the physical world, because in that era, a king's first duty was to survive the battlefield, not quote philosophy. Growing up in such chaos sharpened the young prince's instincts: who to trust, who to fear, who might one day drive a knife into his future. As Edward approached adolescence, the kingdom cracked open. Civil war erupted as the Despensers manipulated the throne. The nobility rose in fury. The people groaned under heavy taxes and military failure. And Isabella, once the quiet queen, became something else entirely. She aligned with Roger Mortimer, an exiled lord with a talent for rebellion. Whispers spread that she intended to dethrone her husband. Whispers spread that she had abandoned loyalty entirely. Whispers, too, began circling Edward himself. The heir might soon be forced into choosing between his father and the growing storm. By the time he reached 13, rumors thundered through the court. Isabella and Mortimer were gathering strength on the continent. A return with an army seemed inevitable, and young Edward found himself drawn toward the heart of a conflict he never asked for. History does not wait for permission, it simply arrives. And so part one ends at the edge of that threshold, where a child stands before the door of a revolution that will define the rest of his life and reshape the future of England. We move forward from that fragile moment where a 13-year-old boy stood unknowingly at the hinge of history and stepped directly into the slow, deliberate gathering of a storm that would swallow his family whole. Nothing changed overnight, at least not in ways visible to the young Edward. The castle routine stayed polite, the servants continued their hushed steps, and the rituals of royalty still played out with their usual cold precision. But beneath that thin surface, something deep and irreversible had begun. Rumors multiplied, alliances shifted in the dark, and the air itself seemed to tighten with the weight of choices already made. Edward was no longer a child shielded from the cracks of the throne. He was now a thread woven into them. Many years later, people would say that everything started when Queen Isabella crossed the Channel. But in truth, the shift began earlier, born quietly in resentment, sharpened by humiliation, and sealed by the cold reality that a queen had been pushed aside until rage became her only language. Isabella had been treated as a pawn for too long married young, ignored publicly, and forced to watch her husband hand power to men she considered unworthy. The Despensers, father and son, had turned the court into their stage. Every favor, every land grant, every legal manipulation pointed toward their growing influence. And Isabella, daughter of a French king, felt the insult deeply. No queen with royal blood in her veins accepts diminished dignity forever. When she traveled to France under the pretext of diplomacy, ostensibly to negotiate peace between her husband and her brother, the king, something shifted inside her, and something dangerous shifted around her. In France, Isabella found more than refuge. She found an audience. She found a place where her anger could crystallize into strategy. She found Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had fled England after rebelling against Edward II and the Despensers, and the bitterness he carried matched Isabella's perfectly, like two sharp edges designed to form a single blade. He possessed military loyalty, noble lineage, and a bruised ego yearning for revenge. Isabella possessed legitimacy, royal intelligence, and something far more potent, a son whose name alone could move armies. Together, they became the nucleus of a rebellion that would reshape the monarchy. Edward, still in his early teens, was sent to France supposedly for safety, though in truth it placed him in Isabella's hands as the final piece she needed. The boy had no way of understanding that his arrival on French soil would serve as the symbolic declaration of a new political reality. The heir to the English throne had effectively been pulled from his father's reach. Even before the first mercenaries were hired, before the first banners were stitched, the English crown had already begun to tilt away from Edward II. What must it have felt like for a young prince, far from home, watching adults whisper in corners, eyes darting toward him not with affection but calculation? Edward was courteous, well-trained, observant. Yet he was still a child in the presence of a mother whose heart had transformed into something hard and unforgiving. Isabella loved her son, but she also needed him. She needed his presence to cloak her rebellion in legitimacy. She needed him as the face of a future she intended to carve open by force. Months passed. Alliances deepened, and soldiers were quietly purchased with French gold. The Count of Hainaut pledged troops in exchange for a future marriage between his daughter and the young prince. It was not romance. It was warfare packaged as matrimony. Every decision Isabella made in those months was cold and exact, as if she were cutting pieces from a chessboard until her opponent had nowhere left to move. Behind her, Mortimer sharpened plans with the same precision, and beside them, though not fully aware, stood Edward, the symbol around which everything revolved. When their army finally sailed for England, it was not an invading foreign force, but something far more unsettling, a rebellion wearing the face of the rightful heir. They landed quietly on the shores of Suffolk, their armies small but burning with purpose, their message simple enough to rally the dissatisfied nobility, instantly deliver England from the tyranny of the Despensers. Within days, crowds gathered to their side. Lords who had once trembled under the king's authority now abandoned him publicly. Even London, the beating heart of royal power, cracked. The people poured into the streets, shouting for justice, for liberation, for vengeance. It did not take long for word to reach the king that the tide had turned irrevocably. Edward II fled west, dragging the younger dispenser with him, but fear erodes judgment. The kingdom he had failed to nurture now failed him in return. Gates that should have opened shut against him. Soldiers who should have fought surrendered. His authority dissolved like a candle left in the rain. For the young prince traveling with Isabella, every day brought revelations. He was not prepared for grand councils swearing allegiance to him, nobles kneeling before him, people cheering for him as though he embodied salvation. Yet even as admiration surrounded him, Edward could sense the unease threading through it. None of these displays truly belonged to him. They belonged to the rebellion. He was not the architect of this upheaval. He was its banner. When the rebels finally cornered Edward II, there was no final battle worthy of a king, no last stand, no dramatic clash of swords. Instead, he was captured like a fugitive dragged from hiding, stripped of dignity, and escorted under guard to the fortress of Kenilworth. And in the quiet chambers of that castle, something happened that England had not seen before. A king was asked to give up his crown. What must it have been like for young Edward to hear that his father wept as he was forced to abdicate? Did he feel guilt, relief, confusion, or a dawning sense of destiny rising unsteadily inside him? No written chronicle captures the private heartbeat of that moment. But it is not hard to imagine the prince standing in a dimly lit room, the fire crackling low, as a courtier bowed before him and announced that by will of Parliament, by will of the nobles, by will of the Queen, he was now king, Edward III, crowned at 14 years old. It was supposed to be a triumph, a moment of celebration. Yet the crown he inherited was not a gift, but a blade. Because while the ceremonies proclaimed him ruler of England, the truth whispered behind the tapestries was colder. His mother and Mortimer held the reins. He was king in name only, watched constantly, his decisions filtered, his authority absorbed into theirs. Every parchment he signed carried their shadow. Every decree spoken in his name carried their intent. During those early years, Edward lived in a palace wrapped in velvet and danger. The corridors were filled with murmurs, complaints about taxation, outrage at Mortimer's arrogance, suspicions about Isabella's influence. Nobles bristled at being governed by a queen and an unappointed favorite. Parliament grew uneasy. Whispers of corruption and excess made their way through taverns and courts alike. And all the while, the young king observed everything with an increasingly sharpened mind. He watched the way Mortimer strutted as though he wore the crown himself. He watched the way Isabella softened only for her lover and hardened toward her son. He watched the way the realm bent under a new tyranny, different in shape, but similar in weight to the one they had overthrown. And slowly, steadily, the prince who had once been a pawn began to understand his role. Not the role someone else had assigned him, but the one history was carving inside him. A future king was waking up, and though he did not yet move against the pair who ruled in his name, something inside him was gathering quiet, patient, impossible to stop once ignited. We continue from that simmering tension where a young king walked the halls of his own palace like a guest in a gilded cage, and now move into the moment when quiet observation began to ferment into something sharper, something that would reshape the fate of England. The boy who had once been swept along by the ambitions of others was slowly learning to read every flicker of power in a room, every calculation behind a nod, every tremor of resentment under polished, courtly manners. Edward III was growing, and with every month that passed, the illusion that Isabella and Mortimer could rule forever thinned like worn fabric. The court itself had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. Mortimer carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. He walked into councils before the king, spoke over the king, negotiated treaties in the king's name without any intention of seeking his approval. His titles multiplied absurdly fast: Earl of March, Lord of vast estates, Commander of armies, arbiter of disputes, while the actual King of England sat beside him, expected to smile politely at every decree that chipped away at his own authority. Isabella, too, reveled in a newfound dominance. Once the sideline queen, she now presided over the realm with a confidence sharpened by triumph and bitterness. She enjoyed her power almost as much as Mortimer enjoyed flaunting it, but the nobility watched all this with narrowing eyes. They had helped overthrow Edward II because they believed they were saving the kingdom from tyranny, not handing it to a new one. Mortimer's arrogance, his greed, his open relationship with Isabella, each offense added weight to a growing sense of outrage simmering within the upper ranks of English society. Some whispered that he was worse than the Despensers had ever been. And the most dangerous whispers of all suggested that England now had no king, only a puppet. Edward heard all of it. He heard it in the strained voices of advisers forced to bow before a man they despised. He heard it in the guarded tone of messengers reporting rebellion in the countryside. He heard it in Parliament's uneasy debates, where members complained slowly at first, then boldly that Mortimer had become a second king. And above all, he heard it in the silence that followed every meeting, the silence that acknowledged what no one dared say aloud if Edward wished to rule. Mortimer would have to fall, yet the young king could not act too quickly. Mortimer was vigilant, ruthless, and deeply embedded in the machinery of government. He commanded loyalty from armed men and influence in the courts, and he had the loyalty, or at least the emotional complicity of Isabella, whose presence beside him made him even harder to dislodge. Edward could not simply confront them. A misstep would mean imprisonment at best, assassination at worst. For now, he performed the role expected of him, the agreeable young monarch, nodding through Mortimer's decrees, signing papers prepared by others, wearing the crown with a gentleness that belied the steady storm forming beneath his ribs. Still, it is impossible to hide ambition forever. As Edward approached his 18th birthday, his posture began to change. His voice carried more weight in council. He questioned decisions with sharper phrasing, subtle enough not to provoke Mortimer directly, but pointed enough that others took notice. Advisors who once dismissed him as a child now began watching him with newfound respect, and the nobility hungry for a true king started aligning themselves quietly with his cause. He became a gravitational force, pulling the discontented toward him. Meanwhile, tensions in the kingdom intensified. The former king, Edward II, was dead, but rumors spread like wildfire claiming he was still alive, hidden somewhere, waiting to reclaim his throne. Such whispers threatened to unravel Mortimer's legitimacy entirely. The Earl of Kent, convinced the rumors were true, became entangled in a plot to free the deposed king. Mortimer crushed it mercilessly, having Kent executed before any true investigation. It was a shocking move, one that horrified the nobility and revealed the full depth of Mortimer's fear. He was terrified of anything that could weaken his grip on power, even the ghost of a man he had already defeated. This act sent a tremor through Edward. To see his own uncle executed for believing his father still lived, whether the rumors were true or not, must have felt like a blade pressed against the future king's throat. Mortimer had shown he would not hesitate to kill nobles, blood relatives, or anyone he perceived as a threat. Edward understood immediately what this meant. Mortimer would not relinquish power willingly. He would have to be removed surgically, with precision and secrecy. And so the young king began to knit together a network of loyal allies. Among them was William Montague, a man fiercely devoted to Edward and possessing the kind of courage needed for actions too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Montague became the architect of the plan that would one day change everything. But first, they had to study Mortimer's routines, his guards, the structure of the castle where he sheltered beside Isabella. They had to understand the locks, the passageways, the guards' rotations. It was less like planning a political coup and more like planning an assassination, though Edward was determined that the act, when it came, would carry the dignity of royal justice, not the stain of murder. Isabella sensed that her son was drifting away from her. Perhaps she saw it in his posture, in the way he no longer sought her approval, or in the increasingly firm tone he used when addressing members of the council. But she could not stop it. Her own authority had been built on broken bonds, broken marriage, broken trust, broken loyalty. Eventually, every fracture returns to its source. Meanwhile, Mortimer interpreted Edward's awakening confidence not as a threat, but as a phase. He underestimated the young king. This was his greatest mistake. And as the year inched toward autumn, court life moved toward Nottingham Castle, a location Mortimer believed secure. Guards loyal to him filled the halls. Isabella remained near him always. Edward played his role with delicate precision, never revealing the thoughts racing beneath his composed surface. But outside the castle walls, Montague and the others prepared. They knew that inside those ancient stones was a hidden passage, an old tunnel once used by previous monarchs to move unseen through the fortress. It would become the artery through which history would slip. The night approached. Edward waited. Mortimer slept within walls he believed impenetrable. Isabella, for all her intelligence, did not yet sense how close the blade had come. And in the quiet of those days leading to the moment, a transformation settled fully within the young king. He was done being ruled. He was done being handled. He was done being a symbol held up by others. A king was awakening not with rage, but with clarity. Nottingham Castle would become the place where childlike obedience ended and where sovereignty began. We slip now into the silence before the breaking point. The kind of silence that feels heavy rather than calm, stretched thin across a castle that believed itself protected. Nottingham, with its thick walls and deep chambers, had been chosen by Mortimer precisely because it seemed impenetrable. Guards patrolled every angle. Emissaries moved in and out carrying messages stamped with Mortimer's seal, and Isabella remained close at his side, trusting her lover's confidence more than her son's quiet evolution. It was the perfect fortress except for the one flaw: no tyrant ever anticipates the determination of a king who has finally decided to reclaim what is his. Daylight passed as usual, full of formalities and polite performances. Mortimer attended councils he manipulated. Isabella issued opinions that shaped policy, and Edward sat among them, watching, absorbing, letting his youth disguise the sharpened intent gathering beneath his every gesture. To Mortimer, he was still the boy he had puppeteered for years, but to those who had quietly aligned themselves with Edward, his presence was beginning to radiate something unspoken, a shift in gravity, a quiet authority coiling into readiness. Montague spent those days calculating every detail: the number of guards near Isabella's chamber, the thickness of each wooden door inside the keep, the alignment of torches, the timing of footsteps, the routes servants used at night. He studied the hidden passage, an old medieval device known as the secret way, originally designed as an escape tunnel for kings. It had not been used in living memory, but castle architecture has a long lifespan, and so do secrets. If anything, time had made the passage more useful. No one remembered it existed. Edward knew the plan, but he carried the weight of it alone. No outward sign betrayed him. He attended meals, offered polite conversation, even walked the corridors with a calmness that belied the storm inside him. Perhaps Isabella noticed something some distance that hadn't been there before, but she did not act on it. Mortimer, swollen with ego, assumed that fear would keep Edward docile forever. Power blinds, and his eyes had long since lost the ability to see threats forming quietly behind stillness. Night fell over Nottingham Castle with a velvety darkness that seemed to encourage secrecy. Torches flickered along the outer walls, and the last murmurs of the court dissolved into the stone. The corridors thinned of servants. The nobles retreated to their rooms, and soon only the sentries' slow steps punctuated the hush. The castle believed itself asleep, but Edward did not sleep, nor did the men waiting below. Crouched near the hidden entrance to the passage, their breaths steady, their hands on the hilts of blades meant not for battle, but for the swift neutralization of guards. Montague stood among them, listening for the signal. Inside his chamber, Edward listened too. Every sound sharpened the distant clatter of armor, the sigh of the wind against the shutters, his own heartbeat pressing against his ribs like a drum preparing to announce something irreversible. He was 18, young for a king, but old enough to understand that tonight he must stop being a figurehead and become the architect of his reign. History would not give him another moment like this. If he faltered, Mortimer would crush him, and Isabella would watch it happen with eyes that once held maternal warmth, but now flickered only with allegiance to another. Edward finally rose, his movements quiet, deliberate. He stepped into the corridor with the poise of someone heading to an ordinary meeting, but the candle he carried threw long shadows across the wall, shadows that marked the divide between the world he had endured and the world he would claim. When he reached the guarded area of the castle, he lowered the candle, his signal. Montague and the others surged silently through the hidden passage. What followed was swift, brutal, and utterly precise. They emerged through a trap door into the depths of the castle, rendering the nearby guards unconscious before a cry could escape their throats. The men moved like a single organism, fueled by months of planning and the knowledge that one mistake would end them all. Edward met them in the dim hallway, and for the first time he did not stand behind anyone he led. The group advanced deeper, toward the royal apartments where Mortimer and Isabella resided. The closer they came, the heavier the air grew, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that what happened next would alter not just the king's life, but the shape of England itself. Edward felt the weight of that truth, but he did not hesitate. A kingdom built on borrowed authority was no kingdom at all. It was a cage. Tonight he would break it. They reached the final chamber. Outside it, Mortimer's closest guards stood watchful loyal men, hand-picked, dangerous. But even danger succumbs to surprise. Montague struck first, silencing the nearest guard before he could draw breath to shout. Steel met wood, boots collided with bodies. A scuffle erupted, a muffled, desperate struggle in the dark. Within moments, the hallway was still again. Edward stepped over a fallen guard, not with cruelty, but with resolve. Then he opened the door. Inside, Isabella and Mortimer were seated beside a hearth, speaking in low tones. They froze at the sight of the young king entering with armed men behind him. Mortimer surged to his feet, reaching for a dagger. But Montague was faster, pinning him before the blade could clear its sheath. Isabella stood too, her face pale, her breath catching somewhere between fear and disbelief. Edward looked at her first. Perhaps he expected a flash of regret. Perhaps he hoped some small, flickering part of him that she would understand why this had to happen. Instead, he saw only shock, layered over years of choices that had placed her beside the wrong man, in the wrong fight, at the wrong time. Mortimer fought wildly, shouting accusations, invoking treason, claiming authority he never truly had. But Edward spoke above him, and his voice, usually gentle, almost diplomatic, now carried a clarity that struck the room like a blade. You have ruled in my name for the last time. Those words, simple as they were, severed 3 years of manipulation in a single stroke. Mortimer was bound, dragged from the chamber to await judgment. His shouts echoed down the hallway, growing smaller with every step until they vanished into the stone belly of the castle. Isabella remained standing, trembling, her eyes locked on her son. Nothing passed between them, no apology, no accusation, only the quiet recognition that whatever bond once existed had been altered forever. Edward stayed in the chamber long after the others left. He did not revel in victory, nor tremble with fear. Instead, he felt something new settle around him, something steady, weighty, undeniably his. For the first time since the crown had touched his brow, he was king not by name, not by ceremony, not by Parliament's decree, but in truth. And outside, somewhere deep in the cold castle corridors, Roger Mortimer understood that a new reign had begun. We move forward from that turning point inside Nottingham Castle, the moment when the doors flew open, when Mortimer's shouts faded into stone, when Isabella's silence became heavier than any accusation, and now enter the first breaths of Edward III's true reign. The night of the coup had been a storm contained within walls, but the morning that followed was something else entirely, a quiet that felt like a newborn kingdom stretching its limbs after years of restraint. Edward emerged from his chamber, not as a boy playing king, not as a puppet whose strings had finally frayed, but as a sovereign whose authority no longer needed explanation. Yet the task ahead of him was immense, because removing the usurper was only the beginning. Now he had to hold together a realm that had been bent, twisted, and nearly broken by a decade of political betrayal. That morning, as pale sunlight slipped across the castle's flagstones, the court gathered with a mixture of caution and hope. No one knew exactly what version of Edward would step forward. Would he be harsh, seeking revenge? Would he be gentle, shaped by the uncertainty of his youth? Would he treat the kingdom with suspicion, now that every corridor of his life had been marked by betrayal? But Edward entered the hall with a composure so serene it carried more force than anger ever could. He walked the length of the chamber, not quickly. No great king rushes, but steadily, the hem of his cloak brushing the stone, as if marking out a new path for the realm itself. He did not look for Isabella, though she stood at the far end, her posture a fragile mixture of defiance and wounded pride. Once, she had been his protector. Once, she had been the force that shaped his destiny. But now she was a woman caught between history and consequence. And Edward knew that any attempt to reconcile the mother with the queen would only cloud the clarity he needed to rule. He did not scream at her, did not condemn her publicly. He simply let the silence between them become the verdict time would carry forward. Isabella would not be imprisoned in chains that cruelty would belong to smaller men, but she would be kept from power. Her days spent in quiet isolation, where the noise of politics could no longer warp her judgment. Mortimer, of course, met a different fate. A trial was held, though trial was a generous word for a process where every noble in attendance had already carried the verdict inside them long before the charges were spoken aloud. The crimes were read out one after another: arrogance, overreach, corruption, manipulation of the crown, unlawful executions, treason through presuming the powers of the king, and the shadowy role he played in Edward II's death. Mortimer stood through it all with a look that wavered between disbelief and indignation, unable to comprehend that the boy he had once dismissed as harmless was now the man sealing his future. When the sentence was passed and his body was taken to Tyburn, Edward did not watch. A king need not witness the fall of the man who tried to eclipse him. Power is not proven through spectacle, it is proven through permanence. With Mortimer gone and Isabella removed from court life, England adjusted itself like a great machine whose gears had finally been oiled after years of grinding strain. But even in that early bloom of freedom, Edward understood that a throne reclaimed is not the same as a throne secured. A king must define himself not only through what he destroys, but through what he builds. And so he set his gaze outward toward the borders, toward the unrest that had festered while the court devoured itself, toward the enemies who had watched England stumble and now expected her to fall. Scotland was the first to demand his attention. The northern border had been a wound for decades, pulsing pain through every reign that attempted to tame it. Edward's grandfather, Edward I, had marched into Scotland with the full force of ambition and nearly bent the entire country beneath England's will. His father had then unraveled everything through indecision and misplaced alliances. Now the Scots sensed opportunity. A kingdom in turmoil is a battlefield waiting to be taken. Even as Edward solidified his authority in the aftermath of the coup, scouts brought troubling news. Scottish raiders were pushing deeper into northern towns, burning, pillaging, testing England's strength like wolves probing a weakened stag. Edward felt no fear in the face of these reports, only a rising certainty, a calling of sorts. War was not something he pursued out of bloodlust or vanity. It was the arena in which kings proved the truth of their sovereignty. And this truth was something he needed not just for England, not just for the nobility watching his every move, but for himself. Because although he now held the throne in his hands, the echoes of years spent overshadowed by others still lingered. Victory in battle would silence those echoes. It would announce to Europe that Edward III was not his father, not a boy king, not a puppet, but a ruler forged in upheaval and sharpened by necessity. The planning began almost immediately. Edward called his councils, listened to his commanders, and weighed strategies with the patience of a man twice his age. Unlike many young rulers, he did not assume brilliance belonged only to him. He gathered input from veterans who had fought under his grandfather. He spoke with northern lords who understood Scotland's terrain like the lines on their palms. He studied the failures of past campaigns and dismantled their mistakes piece by piece. The young king was not reckless, he was methodical, deliberate, and fiercely focused. The army he assembled was not vast compared to those commanded by other nations, but it carried something more valuable than sheer size loyalty. Men followed Edward not because they were forced to, but because they believed in him. They believed he was the kind of king England had been waiting for. His youth did not diminish their faith. If anything, it magnified their hope. A young king meant new beginnings, possibilities unclouded by the grudges of old men. And Edward, in return, understood the silent contract between leader and soldier. They offered him their lives, and he must offer them a future built from purpose rather than chaos. Before the first march northward, Edward visited the training grounds at dawn. He walked among the archers adjusting their longbows, among the cavalry preparing their horses, among the infantry sharpening blades that would soon drip with the frost of Scotland's cold winds. He spoke little, but the soldiers watched him with quiet reverence. Leadership does not always require grand speeches or theatrical displays. Sometimes it reveals itself simply through presence, the presence of a man who stands tall, unwavering, the air around him humming with conviction. When Edward finally rode north, the people lined the roads to see him pass. Mothers held up their children. Old men removed their caps. Traders paused their carts. Many of them had lived through the worst years of Edward II's reign, years marked by humiliation, defeat, and the constant fear that England itself might fracture. To see the new king ride with such calm authority, with the sun glinting along the edge of his mail, felt like watching the country inhale for the first time in years, castle by castle, town by town. Edward reclaimed what had been slipping through England's grasp. His movements were swift, his decisions unhesitating, his sense of timing uncanny. And when he finally faced the Scottish forces in open confrontation, he demonstrated not only courage but tactical brilliance. His reliance on the longbow, his positioning on high ground, his ability to read the unfolding chaos of battle, all of it signaled the rise of a commander whose name would soon echo across Europe. The victory was decisive, almost shocking in its clarity. Scotland's strength buckled under his strategy, and the northern lords hailed him not with hollow praise, but with the fierce sincerity of men who had feared defeat for far too long. England, for the first time in decades, felt unified. It felt strong. It felt guided. And as Edward rode south again, with the cold wind at his back and the cheers of his soldiers lifting into the sky, he understood something profound. Power reclaimed is fragile, but power demonstrated is unshakable. England had a king again, and Europe was about to learn what that truly meant. We follow Edward southward from the echo of that first great victory, his cloak rippling behind him. His soldiers' cheers fading into the wind and move now into a different current of history, one thicker and stranger, one that would eventually pull England into a conflict so vast that its shadow would stretch across an entire century. The realm greeted Edward as a returning hero. But triumph does not erase tension, it only shifts its shape. In the glow of victory, England began to sense that its young king was no longer simply mending the wounds left by others. He was preparing to reach beyond the borders of what any English monarch had dared attempt. And if the Scottish wars had awakened the commander within him, then France would awaken something far larger, the architect of an empire. But the seeds of war with France were not sown on battlefields. They were planted in the delicate, brittle terrain of royal bloodlines territory, far more dangerous than any stretch of land soldiers might cross. The death of Charles of France, Isabella's brother, had created something of a vacuum years earlier, a space where claims and counterclaims hovered like smoke. Edward's own lineage made him a legitimate contender for the French throne by the logic of ancestry. His mother was the daughter of Philip IV. giving him a bloodline that the French nobles feared precisely because it was too strong. They wanted a king they could influence, not an English boy who might unify two crowns. So they chose Philip of Valois, placing him on the throne with that familiar medieval blend of ceremony, politics, and quiet panic. At first, this decision might have seemed like a distant irritation to Edward, one more small fracture in the already complicated relationship between the two kingdoms. But after Mortimer's fall, the air around the English court changed. Foreign envoys watched the young king with renewed calculation. France grew wary. Scotland, having barely survived its last encounter, leaned harder into its alliance with the French crown. And Edward, who had spent his childhood navigating webs of betrayal within his own home, now understood instinctively when someone beyond England's borders was working against him. Tensions escalated with slow inevitability. Complaints were exchanged through diplomatic letters, each one polite on the surface, yet sharp enough to draw blood beneath the ink. Philip of France accused Edward of failing to honor feudal obligations tied to the Duchy of Aquitaine. Edward countered that French interference along the borders was intolerable. These grievances might have remained political irritations, if not for something more insidious. France began funding Scotland's resistance, feeding Edward's enemies in the north like a fire stoked from across the sea. This, Edward could not ignore. He understood perfectly well the symbolism behind such interference. France was not just provoking him, it was testing him. And nothing sets a young king aflame quite like the realization that someone, somewhere, believes he does not yet know how to rule. In the shadows of these rising tensions, Edward's advisors began murmuring about possibilities grand, dangerous possibilities. What if he pressed his claim to the French throne? What if the insult delivered years earlier could be turned into a justification for war? What if England, for the first time, could extend its influence not just through scattered territories, but through a crown that touched two nations? War was no longer a question. It was an approaching tide. But tides do not crash all at once. Before Edward could aim his gaze across the channel, he had to gather allies. This was not a war England could wage alone. So the king who had grown up surrounded by deceit now moved through Europe with the precision of a man who finally understood the game being played. He secured promises from the Low Countries, from German princes, from the Holy Roman Emperor himself. These alliances were not friendships, they were business transactions bought with gold, promises, and the subtle charisma that Edward carried like a blade hidden beneath velvet. The more support he gained on the continent, the more France sensed danger, and the more nervous France became, the more aggressively it behaved. In a move that would later be recognized as the spark of a legendary conflict, Philip of France confiscated Aquitaine, the duchy Edward legally controlled by right of inheritance. With that single stroke, he attempted to strip the English king of a crucial foothold on French soil. It was an insult that did not merely demand a response, it demanded a reckoning. Edward did not hesitate. He summoned Parliament, not as a boy seeking approval, but as a king demanding recognition of a truth already forming in his mind. If France wanted a war, it would be a war conducted on English terms, under English banners, and at the command of an English monarch whose childhood had been carved by upheaval and sharpened into resolve. Parliament listened. England, weary of internal conflicts yet invigorated by Edward's success against Scotland, offered its support. Gold was raised. Ships were prepared. The longbowmen, those unmatched stormbringers of medieval warfare, were assembled with reverence, for everyone knew that their arrows had already altered the fate of nations. But something deeper stirred beneath all these preparations. Something that would echo through centuries. Edward made a decision that would transform this tension into destiny. He claimed the throne of France, not as a symbolic gesture, not as a negotiator's bluff. He declared it openly. And when a king claims what another king believes is his, the world shifts. Banners change meaning, alliances sharpen, enemies multiply, and history begins scribbling a new chapter, one far larger than any of the men living within it could truly comprehend. By the time Edward's heralds announced his claim, Europe felt the tremor. France recoiled in fury. England steadied itself like a ship tightening its ropes before a storm. And the young king, now no longer shaped by the ambitions of others, found himself standing on the threshold of a conflict that would outlive him, outgrow him, and eventually define an entire era. The road to the 100 Years' War had begun, and Edward, sharpened by betrayal, strengthened by victory, and compelled by the legacy he intended to forge, stepped forward without hesitation. We move now from the moment Edward claimed the French crown, a declaration that rolled across Europe like distant thunder, and step into the first great convulsions of the war itself, where rumors hardened into armies and fear thickened into strategy. This stage of Edward's life no longer concerned palace intrigue or the delicate poison of court politics. The battlefield became his language now, and the channel transformed from a strip of water into a corridor through which destiny traveled in both directions. What awaited him on the other shore was not just an enemy, but an entire system of power that believed England had overreached, dared too greatly, and would soon be crushed beneath the weight of its own audacity. But Edward did not rush headlong into war. The young king, who had once been forced to mature early, had also learned patience, real patience. The kind that studies currents and waits for the precise moment when a single movement can alter the course of nations. Before any English fleet crossed the Channel, he restructured his military from the ground up, understanding that old methods would crumble against the scale of conflict he was about to unleash. England needed to fight smarter, not simply stronger. So Edward began forging an army that combined social classes in ways earlier kings had never dared. Knights and archers, nobles and commoners, all bound under the same banners. The English longbow, the weapon that would soon become a nightmare for European cavalry, was no longer just a regional specialty. It became the backbone of Edward's vision. He trained men relentlessly, selecting not for rank but for accuracy, endurance, and the uncanny ability to release an arrow with a calmness that bordered on spiritual discipline. Edward had witnessed chaos throughout his childhood. Now he pursued order with a precision that turned every soldier into a living instrument of strategy. Meanwhile, France scrambled. Philip of Valois had expected Edward's claim to be a rhetorical barb, not a declaration of war. Yet as English emissaries moved across the Low Countries building alliances, Philip sensed too late the size of the storm forming beyond his borders. He called upon the chivalric traditions of France, rallying heavy cavalry, banners of noble houses, men whose ancestors had carved their names into legends of crusades and conquests. They were formidable, yes, but also dangerously set in their ways, their pride resting on traditions that could not imagine defeat at the hands of bowmen or formations that ignored the grandeur of mounted charges. While Europe braced, Edward faced a quieter struggle at home. War required money, massive, unforgiving amounts. He had the loyalty of Parliament, but loyalty does not mint coins. So he negotiated with merchants, borrowing sums vast enough to intimidate lesser kings. He pledged wool exports as collateral, a gamble so audacious that it tied England's economic heart directly to the fate of his military campaigns. If he failed in France, he would not merely lose a war, he would bankrupt his nation. Yet Edward carried risk as though it were a perfectly balanced blade, one he had no intention of dropping. In these months before the first great clash, something else stirred within him, a sense of myth forming around his own image. His court grew brighter, more ceremonially refined. He surrounded himself with men whose loyalty bordered on devotion, knights who believed not only in his claim, but in his character. And out of this atmosphere, he began shaping what would soon become the Order of the Garter, a fellowship of warriors tied not by birth, but by honor. It was not yet formalized, but the idea was already alive, a brotherhood forged for a king who wanted to build not just an army, but a legacy. The world took notice. So did France, and so did Scotland. For while Edward prepared to face France, Scotland sensed opportunity again, hoping England's attention had drifted. But this time, the young king did not respond with hesitation. He sent his northern commanders with swift, brutal clarity, crushing the resurgence before it grew teeth. It was a message written in iron: England would not be vulnerable again. And then, at last, after years of tension tightening like a bowstring, Edward raised his banner and set his fleet upon the sea. Crossing the Channel was no simple voyage. The waters churned with storms, and the French navy patrolled aggressively, seeking to cut England's campaign before it could reach the shore. But Edward's fleet was larger than any he had commanded before, and carried not fear but anticipation. Soldiers crowded the decks, staring at the horizon where France waited like a beast half hidden in mist. Some prayed, some sharpened blades, some simply listened to the water, sensing the beginning of something enormous. The first colossal confrontation arrived not on land, but upon the waves, off the coast of Sluys. The French navy attempted to block Edward's passage with a wall of ships chained together, creating a floating fortress designed to overwhelm any assault. They believed that naval combat would protect them from English archers and cavalry. They believed that a king bold enough to invade France would be humbled before ever touching French soil. They believed wrong. Edward saw immediately what had to be done. He ordered his ships to approach in tight formations, turning the channel into a funnel of controlled violence. Archers climbed onto platforms, their longbows raised, arrows poised like the breath before a storm breaks. And when the distance closed, they unleashed a barrage that darkened the sky. The French ships became slaughterhouses. Archers rained death upon the decks. Knights boarded enemy vessels, turning the naval blockade into a series of hand-to-hand battles fought on slick planks and blood-wet boards. French commanders tried desperately to maintain order, but their chained ships trapped them, giving Edward the advantage of movement while they remained pinned in their own formation. It was a massacre of strategy as much as steel. By the end, the sea itself seemed bruised by the weight of the fallen. Edward had won a victory so absolute that no English king had ever achieved its equal on water, and Europe felt the shift instantly. France, stunned, attempted to regroup. England, stunned in a different way, began to realize that its young king was not merely competent, he was extraordinary. But Sluys was only the beginning. As Edward advanced inland, his army moving like a single creature across fields and river crossings, he studied the landscape with a predatory calm. He did not allow triumph to blind him. Victory at sea did not guarantee victory on land. France's cavalry remained formidable, and Philip's forces were gathering. But every step Edward took was imbued with the confidence of a man who had learned, again and again, that destiny favors those who seize it rather than wait politely for it to arrive. And so the stage began to form around him, rolling plains, thick forests, rivers that would soon run thick with the weight of armies. The conflict that had lived in letters and alliances was now taking shape in geography. Edward was preparing for the battle that would define not just his reign, but the entire nature of medieval warfare. A battle where archers would rewrite the laws of combat. A battle where kings would stand across from each other with equal claims, equal pride, and equally unforgiving ambition. A battle that would carve the name Crécy into the bones of history. And Edward, riding at the head of his army, was ready. We step now into the long shadow cast by the road to Crécy, but not yet into the clash itself. Instead, we drift into the long, grinding campaign that carried Edward's army across a foreign landfields, trampled by thousands of boots. Villages emptied at the whisper of approaching soldiers, in the strange, heavy quiet that accompanies a force too large to hide and too determined to stop. This was the part of war most chronicles rush through, yet it is here between the victories that Edward's command truly revealed itself. Because a king is not measured only by the battles he wins, but by how he brings an exhausted, hungry, burning empire in the making through the weeks that lead to those battles. After Sluys, the English army came ashore in Normandy with a confidence bordering on hunger. But Edward knew better than to allow triumph to distort strategy. France was enormous, scattered with fortresses and defended by men who believed their cavalry was the hammer of God. A single victory at sea did not soften the roads inland. So Edward did something unusual for a medieval monarch. He refused to be predictable. Instead of marching directly toward Philip, he allowed uncertainty to become his companion. He led his troops through a sweeping chevauchée an extended campaign designed not only to seize provisions, but to unbalance the enemy, to force Philip to chase a shadow instead of confronting a single stationary threat. English soldiers burned storehouses, seized grain, and dismantled the economic arteries of the regions they passed, not out of cruelty but necessity. War in this era was a machine fueled by scarcity. To starve your enemy was to weaken his resolve. But Edward was not simply raiding, he was observing, testing, learning how France moved when provoked. He watched the speed with which Philip reacted, the routes the French army preferred, the lines of communication between French nobles. In doing so, Edward was not just marching, he was drawing an invisible map across his enemy's territory. Yet the march came at a cost. Soldiers grew tired, armor wore down, food became scarce despite the plundering, and always in the distance, the French army loomed, growing, gathering, preparing. Reports reached Edward daily. Philip had raised a host far larger than the English force, swelled by knights who valued honor above caution. These were warriors who believed in the charge steel, speed, and adrenaline crashing into infantry like a divine fist. To them, the idea that an army of longbowmen could humble them was unthinkable. Edward heard these reports with interest, not fear. He understood that pride was an enemy too. As the English advanced, rivers became obstacles as dangerous as any sword. Bridges were destroyed ahead of them, forcing Edward to improvise crossings under pressure. At one such river, the Seine, the army spent days maneuvering along the banks, with French forces shadowing them from the opposite side. The tension was suffocating two armies marching parallel, perfectly aware of each other yet separated by a strip of water that felt thinner each hour. Every night, soldiers on both sides lit fires that glowed like staring eyes across the dark. Finally, in a stroke of improvisational brilliance, Edward found an unguarded ford. Under cover of fog, he pushed his men across. The French realized too late what he had done. By the time they regrouped, Edward had vanished into the folds of the countryside, moving northward with renewed speed. But this escape did not solve everything. Behind Edward, Philip's army grew larger, angrier, more determined. Ahead of Edward lay unfamiliar terrain and the pressure of a running clock. He needed ground that could turn French strength into French vulnerability. And so, as he approached the Somme, he searched not for a grand arena, but for a trap, a natural shape in the land that could transform his smaller army into a blade rather than a shield. When he found it a rising slope with limited approaches, flanked by marshy earth, he recognized it instantly. He had found the battlefield that would make his longbowmen kings. But he did not declare readiness that night. Instead, he called his men to rest. He allowed them to eat, repair bowstrings, sharpen blades, breathe. A rested army is a dangerous one, and Edward understood that exhaustion is the silent killer of strategy. Meanwhile, the French army moved with the force of a tidal wave behind them, thousands upon thousands of mounted knights glinting beneath the summer sun, banners whipping like angry serpents in the heat. Chroniclers later wrote that the sound of their march resembled thunder trapped between hills. They believed they would crush Edward by sheer magnitude, reducing his foreign incursion to a cautionary tale. But Edward was not merely waiting. He was preparing to shift the very nature of medieval warfare. On the morning before the battle, he walked among his men not with fanfare, not with trumpets, but with the quiet certainty of a commander who knew exactly what he intended to do. He spoke to archers about holding their nerve. He reviewed the positioning of stakes meant to repel cavalry charges. He ensured every line of retreat was removed, not to trap his men, but to focus them. There is clarity in having no escape. It sharpens the senses. It unifies purpose. Edward then positioned his troops in lines that defied French expectations. Archers arranged like wings. Infantry grounded at the center. Knights dismounted to fight alongside common soldiers. It was a formation built not for spectacle, but for efficiency, designed to maximize the English strengths and expose the French weaknesses. But there was one figure on the field whose presence meant more than any strategic choice: the Black Prince, Edward's son, barely 16. The prince was given command of a division, a gesture unprecedented in its daring. Edward was not simply fighting a battle, he was crafting the future. He was showing his son in England that leadership must be baptized in real danger, not sheltered behind royal privilege. Throughout the afternoon, the French army drew nearer, dust rising behind them like smoke from an approaching fire. Yet Edward refused to attack early or reposition out of fear. He let the enemy choose haste. He let them be blinded by impatience. A wise soldier fights with the calmness of a man who expects to win, not the desperation of one who fears losing. When scouts returned to inform him that the French were only a short march away, Edward climbed a nearby mill to view the approaching tide. From that vantage point, he saw the future unfolding, thousands of armored knights charging uphill into a storm of arrows, their pride turning into their downfall. He saw victory. He saw transformation. He saw the moment England would cease to be a troubled kingdom clawing for stability, and instead become a military power that Europe could no longer dismiss. Crécy had not yet been fought, but in Edward's mind in that quiet moment atop the mill, Crécy was already won. And history, waiting patiently at the edge of the field, knew it too. We descend now into the heat and dust of the day that would mark one of the great turning points of medieval warfare, a day that began in anticipation and ended in transformation, when armies collided not with equal confidence, but with equal necessity. Edward had chosen his ground with the precision of a man who understood both nature and human nature. While Philip of France rushed across the landscape driven by pride, Edward settled into a rhythm of readiness. Crécy was not a moment stumbled into by accident, but a deliberate, sculpted encounter, one that would test everything he had learned since childhood, the patience forged through political captivity, the clarity that came from taking back his throne, the tactical instincts sharpened through years of conflict. On the morning of the battle, a thick, restless quiet hung over the English lines. Soldiers woke early, not with fear but with a clarity born from repetition. They had strung their bows, hammered stakes into the ground, organized their supplies, eaten whatever small rations remained, checked their armor for cracks. Each man carried within him the knowledge that today would demand more than endurance, it would demand transformation. Standing on that hillside, they were not merely archers or infantry or dismounted knights. They were the sharp edge of England's destiny. Edward moved among them like a conductor tuning an orchestra, offering no lengthy speeches, no pomp, no theatrics. His presence was the speech. His calm was the reassurance. His steadiness was the anchor on which thousands steadied themselves. He was not the kind of king who led from a distant tower. He was close enough that dust settled on his boots just as it did on theirs. Meanwhile, across the fields, the French army swelled into view, its banners catching the wind in flashes of color. Chroniclers would later write that the French host looked like a glittering sea waves of armored cavalry, squadrons of Genoese crossbowmen, lords and knights adorned in heraldry meant to declare their lineage and pride. They moved fast, too fast, having chased Edward through the countryside with the assumption that exhaustion alone would break the English. But Crécy was the moment they discovered that pursuit and victory are not the same thing. Philip's army arrived disorganized, panting, furious under the heat of the afternoon sun. Knights jostled for placement, horses strained against reins, commands tangled in a storm of impatience, and above all, the French nobles, fueled by pride, insisted on charging immediately. They wanted glory. They wanted to crush the English before nightfall. They wanted the kind of victory that could erase the humiliation of slides. But war punishes arrogance long before it punishes cowardice. Edward watched the disarray with sharp, measuring eyes. He did not gloat. He simply understood that nature itself was already on his side the hill, the drying ground, the sun lowering behind his army, each element forming an invisible ally. The English line stood unmoving, a study in discipline. The first wave belonged to the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries hired by Philip. They were skilled marksmen but exhausted after marching for hours while carrying heavy equipment. And worse for them, Their crossbows, powerful though they were, could not be reloaded quickly. When they advanced within range, Edward gave the signal, and the longbows sang. It was not simply a volley, it was a storm. Arrows rained down in relentless rhythm, each shaft leaving the string with a whisper and landing with a thud, a crack, or a scream. The Genoese lines buckled almost instantly. They raised shields. They retreated. They called for support. But the French nobility, interpreting their withdrawal as cowardice rather than exhaustion, rode them down in fury, trampling their own allies in a disastrous frenzy. The field fractured at that moment, not yet with English victory, but with French confusion. Then came the cavalry. Hundreds, then thousands of armored knights lowered their lances and charged uphill toward Edward's army. It was a sight designed to terrify, steel flashing, hooves pounding, a roar of voices thunderous enough to shake the air. Medieval warfare had long been shaped around this spectacle, around the belief that the mounted knight was the apex predator of the battlefield. But Crécy would rewrite that belief forever. As the knights charged, the longbowmen bent their backs again, their fingers releasing arrows faster than thought. The hillside erupted with shafts that fell in sheets, each arrow powered by a draw strength far beyond that of the crossbow. Horses screamed, threw their riders, or collapsed mid-stride. Knights stumbled forward only to be pierced through joints in their armor armpits, necks, visors. The ground became a killing field shaped not by swords but by geometry. And still the charges came. Dozens of times, French nobles attempted to break the English lines. Each charge grew more desperate, more chaotic, more costly. They slid through mud thickened by blood. They collided with the dead before reaching the living. They found themselves trapped among their own fallen, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat. Some knights suffocated under piles of bodies, their armor becoming tombs. The Black Prince, 16 years old, already burning with a fierce, unshakable brilliance, held command of the vanguard. His position was one of the most heavily attacked, and the French pressed him mercilessly, attempting to break the English right flank. He fought on foot, side by side with his men, showing a steadiness that belied his age. At one point, overwhelmed by the violence crashing against his position, English messengers rode to Edward to ask for reinforcements. Edward refused, not out of cruelty, but understanding. "Let the boy win his spurs," he said calmly. It was not a dismissal, it was a recognition. If the Black Prince could hold, if he could rise from the storm without breaking, then England would gain not just a prince, but a future king forged in the flames of Crécy. The prince held, even as arrows turned the air into a living haze, even as knights crashed against his lines like waves desperate to drown a cliff. Even as banners fell and men died around him, he stood unbroken. His command steadied the entire wing. The English formation did not collapse, not once, not even in the thickest chaos. By evening, the battlefield transformed into a landscape of ruin. The French army, vast, brilliant, noble in appearance, had been undone by its own haste. Philip himself was nearly killed, wounded by arrows, forced to retreat under cover of failing light. His pride, once a blazing torch, flickered into humiliation. Edward did not celebrate wildly. He walked the field with the solemnity of a man who understood that victory, though glorious, was a costly inheritance. Bodies lay scattered, French knights by the hundreds, crossbowmen in tangled heaps, horses crumpled like broken machines. But among the English, though losses existed, there was relief rather than despair. They had done what Europe believed impossible. They had stood against the full power of French chivalry and broken it under the discipline of tactics, terrain, and the unassuming, devastating bow. Crécy was not just a battle won, it was a world reshaped. It marked the end of cavalry supremacy. It announced the rise of infantry and range warfare. It crowned Edward not just as a king, but as a military visionary, and it forged the Black Prince into a living legend whose name would echo for centuries. Yet for all the grandeur of the victory, Edward did not stop. A king does not end a campaign on triumph alone. And as the last arrows fell silent and the sun dipped behind the blood-soaked field, he turned his attention to a fortress whose capture would define England's foothold in France for generations. Calais waited, and Edward intended to take it. We drift now into the final stretch of Edward's long campaign, a stretch quieter in sound perhaps, yet heavier in consequence, as if the very landscape understood that the fate of kingdoms was settling like dust after Crécy. The English army, battered but unbroken, carried the momentum of victory with a kind of solemn pride, like men aware that they had survived a storm that should have swallowed them whole. But Edward knew that victory on a single field does not end a war. Wars end when something immovable is seized, held, and transformed into a symbol that outlasts the sword. And for him, that symbol would be Calais. Calais was no ordinary prize. It was a gateway stone walls facing the sea like a clenched jaw, a harbor that opened into arteries of trade, a fortress France considered untouchable. To hold Calais would mean that Edward could march into the continent whenever he chose, that England would no longer be a visitor in France but a resident. And so, after the drums of Crécy fell silent, the king turned his army toward that stubborn, defiant city. The march itself felt different from the one that had led to Crécy. There was less fear now and more endurance, a slow-burning determination that carried the men through the mud, the wind, the long nights when even the stars seemed tired. When the English arrived, Calais did not greet them with trembling, its gates shut tight, its garrison ready, its citizens prepared to outlast whatever England could bring. Behind those walls was a population unwilling to bend, unwilling to entertain the notion that their fortress might fall. Edward understood immediately that this siege would not be quick. He settled his army around the city like a ring tightening around a pulse. Wooden structures rose, supply lines extended across hostile territory, and the king, rather than returning to England, chose to remain, living in a pavilion through seasons of cold, rain, and aching monotony. Siege warfare is not glorious. It is a slow grinding of wills. And Edward, shaped by years of quiet struggle, was more suited to endurance than most realized. Weeks bled into months. The city rationed its food until bread became a rumor. Soldiers inside the walls scavenged for scraps, while the English starved just a little slower thanks to their supply lines at sea. Through the winter storms and the choking summer heat, the siege held. Ships attempting to break Edward's blockade were driven back into the waves. Messages smuggled in or out of Calais were intercepted, turning hope into a shrinking flame. Even France, and despite its fury, could not reach the city. Philip tried. He gathered a second army, pushed it toward Calais with the desperate energy of a man who knows the spine of his kingdom is bending. But when he arrived, he found the English dug in so deeply that to attack them would have been to repeat Crécy on even worse terms. He withdrew, leaving Calais to its fate, and inside those walls, despair began to bloom. Finally, after nearly a year, the gates opened, not with surrender in the usual sense, but with a procession of 6 gaunt, hollow-eyed burghers, citizens sacrificed by their own city, carrying ropes around their necks, barefoot, offering themselves in exchange for Calais' survival. The English court held its breath, understanding the symbolism, the cruelty, the nobility of it. But Edward, hardened by war's necessities, intended to make a point so sharp that France would feel it long after the last stone of the city changed hands. He ordered their execution. The burghers bowed their head, their faces thin from starvation, their dignity the only wealth they had left, and the English army watched in stunned silence, unsure how to carry the weight of what came next. It was then that Queen Philippa, heavy with child, knelt before her husband in front of the entire army and begged him to spare the men. She did not plead for diplomacy, nor for politics, but for mercy, simple and unadorned, a mercy that might soften the memory of iron and blood with one decisive act of humanity. Edward paused, and mercy, in the end, prevailed. The burghers lived, the gates fully opened, and Calais became an English possession, hold fast, symbol, bridge into the continent, remaining so for over 2 centuries. Edward had not only taken a city, he had carved a permanent mark into the map of Europe. Yet as the king finally turned homeward, the glow of triumph carried threads of exhaustion. Wars win glory, but they also carve hollows into the men who survive them. And for Edward, now older in spirit than in years, the road back to England felt less like a victory march and more like a long exhale held in since childhood. He returned to a kingdom that greeted him with celebration, bells ringing, crowds filling the streets, but beneath the noise, beneath the gratitude, lay something more intimate, a sense that England had crossed a threshold. It had stepped out of the shadow of old kings, old failures, old wounds. It had become, under this young monarch, a land that knew its strength again. Edward III would go on to fight more battles, shape more years, and carve more legacy. But for tonight, just for this gentle, drifting moment, we step back from the clamor of history. We leave the rumble of Crécy behind. We leave the walls of Calais standing silent in the moonlight. We leave Edward in the stillness of a kingdom finally sleeping in peace. Because every great saga, no matter how loud its triumphs, needs a night where the noise fades, where the armor cools, where the king lays his head down and becomes simply a man again. So as you close your eyes, let the echoes of longbows, the crash of waves at Slies, the footsteps in the hidden passage at Nottingham, all soften into a single, steady rhythm, a rhythm meant not for battle, but for rest. And let the story slide away from your thoughts like a tide pulling back into the dark, ready to return another night. Sleep well.